Okay, so ladies and gentlemen of the DC Universe, today I was going to do a news roundup video, and don't get me wrong, we're still talking about some very recent news in this video, but because of that news and some other rumors that are out there, this video is going to be about exploring the potential big bad for DCU Chapter 1. And interestingly, what we're going over today is stuff that I've actually been making videos about every now and again, going as far back to almost a couple of years ago. So we had Daniel RPK, and you guys know he's a scooper. He's got many things right. He's been quoted by major trades, but he's got some things wrong. And he put a few eye emojis on this post from this user, basically quoting a casting description for that Lanterns casting. More on that in a little bit, saying, conspiracy minded. Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't the Center have a cult on Earth? And yes, it did. And we're going to get into that as well, because this kind of all ties in, and especially into that of the Lanterns plot. Now, do correct me if I'm wrong. My memory's getting a bit hazy here. I do feel like Daniel RPK did tease the Center quite a long time ago now. And if you've been subscribed to me for a long time, you'll know that I've covered these Reddit posts back in the day, and I say that as in like 2 years ago on the channel, in the very early days of the formation of the DCU in general and the plan that was cooking up. We had those DCU Reddit posts in where they would post unverified rumors, ones where it's like, yeah, we're just kind of posting this anyway, to what they claim to be verified, so the mods have gone through it themselves. And this was on the DCEU Leaks Reddit page, not the new kind of DCU Leaks one, which they've made since then. And in this post, again, 2 years ago now, there was a bit of a Creature Commandos leak in the somewhat verified sources section. And once again here, it speaks of how Dinosaur Island, which is another name for the Center, would apparently be appearing in some shape or form in the Creature Commandos series. Now, again, I can't confirm this. I haven't seen Creature Commandos myself, but this is what got me talking about it back then, and a bunch of other people being like, oh, wait, the Center could actually be a threat that is slowly cooked up to. Nothing too crazy at the beginning. Again, unfolding over years and unfolding over multiple projects. And that's something a lot of us really did feel like, okay, well, while we can't confirm this, that does seem to be really up James Gunn's street. Because, speaking of kaijus recently with the, Superman toy leaks, and we're going to get into that in a second, and just James Gunn, loving big frickin' things like that. You see where I'm going with this, but let me first really briefly explain what the Center is if you don't know already. So the Center is essentially a being, one that is so old, this entity, if you will, that has been around for millions upon millions upon millions of years, watching life come and go on the planet, to the point of even saving some of the dinosaurs back when the asteroid wiped them out and housed them on this Dinosaur Island, aka the Center, right? Now, eventually, when humanity came about, the Center was chilling and then watching things unfold with mankind. But over time, the Center also observed the havoc that humanity was wreaking on the planet, such as, frickin' nukes and whatnot, the various wars that have taken place, and was kind of like, yeah, maybe humanity needs to go. So if you didn't know already, the Center is essentially this huge thing that you're probably seeing on screen right now. It can dispatch all kinds of creatures, like kaiju level threats, freaking dinosaur level threats. It can disrupt various people with its psychic level threat as well, telepathy, the list goes on. Now, I know not everyone is on board, because when I spoke about this a long time ago, they were like, really? I don't know how I'd feel about like a literal giant-ass floating island with giant kind of kaijus being a threat in the DCU Chapter 1. But I do think that could be a fun thing to explore, especially if built up upon over multiple projects to lead to this somewhat formation of the Justice League. Because in the New Frontier, in the comic book storyline, it was basically a period piece set decades and decades and decades ago during, I think, 1945 to somewhere around 1960 onwards. It matches this influence to the DCU, of which James Gunn recently spoke about, and I'm about to get to that, in where the world had heroes exist and villains for a long time, but at the same time, some heroes didn't even know each other, or like the Justice League wasn't necessarily an established thing in the way you know it. For example, Superman and Batman knew each other, and Wonder Woman knew them, yet Hal Jordan, if I remember correctly, basically had his origin in that story. Martian Manhunter was kind of a newbie to Earth at the time, and it brings all of these heroes together to face up against this really, really big threat. But throughout the course of the story, there's this investigation that unfolds with Batman and Martian Manhunter cottoning on to this cult that worships the center and wants to bring about this doomsday level event. It's really, really interesting stuff, and that's me really condensing a lot of the story there. As I always say, adaptations don't copy and paste, so I'm not saying they're gonna literally adapt the New Frontier to a T. Obviously, the DCU is set in present day. It's not gonna be set in 1945, although I think they could trickle back certain events with regards to the center having had a presence way back in time, maybe with that rumored Sergeant Rock film. Like, we could get into it there. Maybe there's been reports, or it's been on the radar of Waller and other people out there for a long time, but you see where I'm going with this. Now, before I tie this into the Lantern series, because that's where the next really big clues come into all of this, and where I really do feel like it's painting a picture of what is to come. Gunn did say, as reported by DC Film News here recently, that said, I love New Frontier, and its magical alternate history is a big influence on DC Studios. So now that doesn't confirm a whole bunch, especially when he's also said a couple of days later, since a lot of people have, made articles on their various outlets about this, stating that a live-action Justice League The New Frontier film written and directed by DC Studios CEO James Gunn is reportedly in development, and Gunn said, nope, sorry, no truth to this whatsoever. That doesn't shut down everything I'm saying in this video. What Gunn is saying here, technically, even if this was a part of the long-term plan, and I'm not trying to reach here, what he would be saying right now is that this is not true. There is literally no Justice League The New Frontier film being written and in development as of right now. It doesn't mean there won't be in the future, and it also doesn't mean that it will even come to fruition like that. Again, the center and the New Frontiers story could still have a heavy influence on everything that unfolds in the DCU, on top of all of these other inspirations that James Gunn is going to inject into the DCU projects as they unfold, eventually leading up to whatever this overarching threat is. And could that be the center? Yes, but him shutting this down here before anyone says it, that doesn't mean everything I'm about to say isn't true. Although, I do want to say once again, I could be wrong about this. But let's go over some of the other clues, which just makes this story very interesting the more you kind of read into it. So when Lanterns got greenlit, we got an official, somewhat logline, very, very basically describing the show. So the series follows a new recruit, John Stewart, and Lantern legend Hal Jordan, two intergalactic cops drawn into a dark, Earth-based mystery as they investigate a murder in the American heartland. Now, very recently, we've got a few castings for Lanterns, which gave us some other descriptions of these characters. So starting with Sheriff Kelly here, Deadline go and say here that McDonald will play Sheriff Kelly, a no-nonsense woman deeply devoted to her family and close-knit town. Her resilience, shaped by a complex past that's hardened her resolve, anchors her when the community's secrets begin to surface. Now, as a result of that, a lot of people were thinking, okay, well, we know there's a murder in the American heartland. That's most likely going to be taking place, this investigation, in Sheriff Kelly's town, and where there's what sounds to be this kind of creepy, town secrets, as it describes here, that are emerging, that, have given the impression of this kind of culty level thing going on with the residents, especially as whatever these secrets are coming to the surface. You combine that into how James Gunn said,
in it, they discover a terrifying mystery that ties into our larger story of the DCU.
And then to press, when Peter Safran and James Gunn were directly talking to the major trades, they said terrifying mystery, like ancient horror even. So it's been described a few ways. So you now add in Garen Dillahunt's casting in the series, and he is described by Deadline as a self-righteous, conspiracy-minded man who masks his ruthless ambition behind a charming and calculated facade. And he's described as one of the antagonists of the series. So, we have this town with community secrets emerging. We have a conspiracy-minded man who has a ruthless ambition. Daniel RPK, as Scooper is, like, pointing to, this other post saying, well, wait, what wasn't there, like, a cult in the New Frontier comic worshipping the center? And by the way, the first chapter is called Gods and Monsters, which is the same chapter title in the New Frontier for Chapter 4. So very clear influences there, but of course that doesn't confirm any of this. But in an interview or like coverage from DC.com itself, just to show you how there has been different wording used by James Gunn about the Lantern series, Safran literally says here that it's going to be with HBO Max, even though we now know it's HBO, as all of our series are that we're going to talk about today. It is more of a true detective type mystery with our two Lanterns, a terrestrial-based mystery. Then Gunn says that leads into the overall story that we're telling throughout the different movies and television shows. We find this ancient horror on Earth. Now, the reason why I keep hammering down on those various different descriptions of whatever this ancient threat is, this terrifying mystery, but here, this ancient horror, well, what could be more of an ancient horror type threat other than that of the Center, a primordial type being that's been around for millions upon millions upon millions of years. Now, if you want to think like where I'm leading this conversation, that this ancient horror, so the ancient center, aka Dinosaur Island, could be this threat, it could make sense with what Hal Jordan and John Stewart investigate in the Lantern series, with this shady town, with these community secrets that are emerging. We know there's an ancient horror that they come across, and going back to the New Frontier, here you can see panels of Batman, well, John Jones initially as Martian Manhunter, going to this church, investigating, and inside he sees a bunch of cult members there about to sacrifice this freaking kid, but Batman is disrupting the whole thing, and these guys help out. Now, all of these guys are worshipping the center, as you see this one cult member holding this, like, center book that they eventually recover and open and learn a lot more about the ancient threat in the New Frontier storyline. You are the tribute. Without the center, all must fall away. Yours is the glory of nourishing the center's strength. And as this guy is, like, being very bust up, he's saying, you swine will be judged as well. Without the center, there is no holding. And this is quite early on in the story with regards to unfolding the threat and learning more about it between Batman and Martian Manhunter. So, I'm not saying it's going to go down this way in the story. As I really want to emphasize to you guys, adaptations don't copy and paste. So, for example here, I'm just speculating, this kind of investigation that goes down with Batman in the comic book, where they really get a much bigger lead on the center and, what was this cult about? Why are they worshipping this threat? What is going on here? Let's learn more about this from this book. This could now be swapped out into live action with this murder in the American heartland that Jon Stewart and Hal Jordan are investigating, and that's where the casting for Garrett Dillahunt comes in, and maybe they're taking the influence from that cult and somewhat bringing it into this town, and where this true detective murder investigation type thing is taking place. And together, alongside Sheriff Kelly, they learn about this, well, as James Gunn said himself, this isn't speculation, this ancient horror that opens up a much larger contribution to the DCU's overarching story. And in this particular town, maybe they're making sacrifices, I don't know, similar to that of the cult in the comic, and it's drawn the attention of Hal Jordan and Jon Stewart because it's becoming something much bigger. Because that's something we've been wondering. Why are two Lanterns investigating a murder? Why isn't it the cops, Sheriff Kelly herself, the FBI? Like, why are two space cops being brought into this. Well, this could be why, because there could be a lot more to it. I mean, we've always known there's going to be a lot more to it, with Gunn saying and Safran saying how important Lanterns is to setting up their larger story. We know there's self-contained projects and you can watch kind of each project as its own thing, but there's still like this connective tissue, like the Thanos tissue of the early MCU, that is still being built up, right? But now we're looking at all of this. I know I keep going around in circles. It really does make me think if, you know, Garrett Dillahunt's character, it has conned on to this and is really trying to, in his conspiracy-minded ways and his ruthless ambition, bring about the emergence of the Center. And even if you tie in, and I have to admit, this is reaching what we've heard through the toy leaks and rumors going back quite a long time ago as well, by the way, that with there being a kaiju that Superman faces up against in the movie, not like a main plot thing as far as we're aware, it could just be, for all we know, like an opening of the movie, a day in the life of Superman, as I've said, with him just fighting a kaiju. What if there's more to that? It's not really presented as such, but what if he's actually facing a dinosaur-esque kaiju? Dare I say it, right? But it's actually linked to the Center, because the Center does that in the comics, and this could just be a very minute seed of that larger story that is unfolding in the DCU, and where we look more into that in the investigation that Hal Jordan and John Stewart are doing in the Lanterns show, and where they come across potentially the cult, they investigate the murder, they stumble across more that leads them to learn about an ancient threat. Obviously, the Center is absolutely an ancient threat and can be seen as a horror because of the horror it can literally unleash, and, you know, really has the potential to wipe out all of humanity on Earth. So I really do feel like, despite what Gunn has said recently, that we are onto something here, because what else could be an ancient horror in the Lanterns show? I always took into account that whatever they stumble across is pertaining to the main story, the main plot of DCU Chapter 1. And I just couldn't, I was racking my brain, I was like, what else could be an ancient horror? There's the whole Black Lantern thing, I guess, that people were entertaining, and you could argue that could get ancient horror-y, if you will, with regards to Necron maybe trying to pierce the veil, but like, you know, something weird's going on there. But a lot of people were in agreement that that's too cosmic-y as of right now for the first chapter of the DCU to kind of tackle that kind of thing, even though they could adapt it in a different way. So I do want to follow my own, you know, preaching there and saying adaptations don't copy and paste, so they could find a way of doing Black Hand and something creepy, and Hal Jordan and John Stewart stumbling across that. But I still think that the Center's ancient threat, being an ancient being, an entity in of itself, this primordial entity, you know, a part of Earth for the longest time, is more of an ancient threat that is applicable to what investigation could be going down. And with the recent casting descriptions, the fact that this is totally in James Gunn's wheelhouse anyway, with regards to, sure, it may be many, many, many years from now when we actually have multiple heroes facing up against such a big, like, mad Titan-level kaiju threat, which can dispense kaijus out of its kaiju self. That is so in Gunn's wheelhouse. Even if that's years away, I can still imagine, as goofy as that sounds to some of you, and how you don't like the idea of this big bad on paper. I'm not saying everyone, but I have read a lot of comments being like, oh, I don't know, that sounds a bit lame. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be tackled in a very terrifying way. It can be tackled very briefly in Superman or Creature Commandos through Dinosaur Island or seeing a dinosaur or some kind of kaiju, right? But when we go into Lanterns, it could be portrayed in such a scary kind of, if you've seen True Detective, you know what I mean, and you know that they're coming out swinging with the Lantern series, giving it that HBO level pedigree. Like, HBO have such a high standard of quality for shows that they release, so I can really see the Lantern show, as I've gone on about before, being a show that is quite dark, despite having comic book fantastical Green Lanterns with lantern rings and where they suit up and whatnot. But combining that with the True Detective flavor and tone of the series, I do feel like, let's just assume that Garrett Dillahunt's character is a part of a cult, and he's gathered some kind of, you know, population of that community, of that town, to, you know, bring about the emergence of the Center, or trying to do something with it, whether it's, you know, got his psychic link to them, whether it's got anything to do with this book, I don't know. But what I'm trying to get at here is that they can still tackle the introduction or the impending threat of this big bad, even if it is on paper, oh, an island that can dispense kaijus and whatnot. But they can do it in such a sinister, terrifying way, in where it's actually creepy. Like, the human representatives of this eventual big bad that we'll see one day in that of the Center could be still presented very creepily. So I don't think anything with the Center is going to start rolling. Like, the wheels aren't going to hit the ground and start spinning and going from first to second to third gear for a long time. I think gears are going to be changed progressively from first to second gear over years. Again, we've got Superman, then we've got Peacemaker. Yes, they're going to film Lanterns, but we've got Supergirl. But, like, do you know what I mean? We might not get our first gear change into second gear with regards to the Center's big bad Chapter 1 threat storyline until Lanterns. And then after that, we might only be changing into third gear a couple of years later after that. Do you see what I mean? So it's still, like, when you go out into perspective, something that is to be handled over a long amount of time to ultimately, you know, I think we can all agree, even though we don't have the announcements right now, at the end of, like, since this is a 2-chapter plan over 8 to 10 years, as of Chapter 1 and then Chapter 2, at the end, you have to assume, that there's going to be some kind of team-up level film with multiple heroes. But I still like the idea of this because I feel like they can make something as kind of goofy sounding as a floating island and this primordial kind of being that is the Center to be this ancient horror that Hal Jordan and John Stewart first start to learn about in the Lantern series. But I also do think it would be a good idea to take, I mean, as Gunn's already confirmed, it does have a great influence on the DCU because even out of that, you can take how it was this somewhat retelling or like new iteration of the heroes of the DCU coming together to face up against something in a DCU that already in that comic book storyline picked up with multiple heroes already existing. It's a similar parameter to the status quo of the DCU we're picking up with in present day when we launch into the live action of Superman, or even before that with Creature Commandos. So I know this has been quite a big ramble from me, but I am dying to know your thoughts. Do you think there's any substance to this? Do you think that even though they wouldn't adapt the comic book storyline page for page, panel for panel, and they could change things up quite dramatically again with Hal Jordan and John Stewart stumbling across the Center's threat rather than Batman coming across that cult, do you think an ancient horror, as described by James Gunn himself, fits the Center being an ancient entity and arguably an ancient horror that can, you know, display all of this horror on Earth through what it can do and what it's capable of? Or do you think it's something else completely different? But that is enough from me. That is enough from me. If you've made it to this part of the video, would really appreciate a like. Do get involved in the comments down below. I love interacting with you guys there. Even if I can't interact with every single one of you, I read every single comment. Consider subscribing for more updates like this. I will keep you up to date if we learn anything more. But other than that, this is just going to be bookmarked in my brain as something of peak interest when it comes to this ancient thread that pertains to the overarching story of the DCU. I do feel like we're going the right direction, but let me know if you agree or disagree. But until next time, thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you people of the DCU in the next video. Goodbye.